The stars in the outer Hellion corridor did not move. They never did. They just hung there in the black like cold fire. Millions of miles apart, indifferent to everything that passed between them. No sound, no wind, nothing but the slow, endless silence of deep space. It was in this silence that fleet Admiral Jacoth stood on the bridge of his flagship and felt, for the first time in many years, something close to pleasure. He was tall, even by Vreth standards. His skin was the color of slate after rain, a dark gray-blue that deepened at the joints and along the ridges of his jaw. His eyes were wide and pale, almost white, the kind of eyes that had looked at many things and found most of them unworthy of extended attention. He had 4 arms, as all Vreth did, and he kept the lower pair folded behind his back in a habit so old it had become part of how others recognized him from a distance. The upper pair he used to gesture, to point, to command. He had been commanding for a long time. 31 years in the Vreth dominions. Military, 11 systems brought under Dominion control, 3 species made to kneel, and 2 others that had been erased entirely because kneeling was not in their nature. He had never lost an engagement, not once, not even the small ones that other admirals dismissed as routine. He treated every encounter the same way he had treated the first one when he was young and unknown and hungry, with total focus, with complete intent. Now he stood on the bridge of the endless dominion, his flagship 700 long, crewed by 4,000 Vreth soldiers and officers, and looked through the forward viewport at a single human ship drifting alone in the dark. It was not moving. It sat in space the way a stone sits at the bottom of a river, passive, still. Its running lights blinked slowly, a dull amber rhythm that was almost lazy in how steady it was. The ship was long and angular, built without the curves that most Vreth vessels favored, all flat panels and hard edges, like someone had decided that beauty was not a military requirement. It was painted a dark gray that made it difficult to see against the black of space unless you were looking for it. Jacoth was looking for it. He had been looking for it for 6 hours. His armada had picked up the vessel's energy signature near the edge of the Hellion corridor 3 days ago, and he had spent those 3 days calculating. The corridor was a stretch of space that the Vreth Dominion considered theirs by proximity, though no formal boundary had been established. Humanity, that young fumbling species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel within the last 80 of their short years, had apparently decided to push a ship through it without asking permission. Typical, Jacoth had thought when the report first crossed his desk. Young species always did things like this. They didn't understand the rules because they hadn't been taught the rules yet. That was fine. Teaching was something the Vreth were very good at. He had brought 7 ships not because he expected a fight, he didn't, but because 7 ships sent a message more clearly than 2. He wanted the humans to understand when they saw his armada come out of faster-than-light transit exactly what kind of situation they were in. He wanted the math to be obvious. 1 of them, 7 of us go home. But the human ship had not run when his armada appeared. It had not raised its shields. It had not charged its weapons, or at least the passive energy readings his scouts were getting didn't suggest any weapons were being charged. It had simply continued to drift, running lights blinking, doing Absolutely nothing. Jakoth had waited. He was patient. He could wait. The ship continued to do nothing. He had sent a standard hailing frequency, the kind the Vreth used with all new species, a mathematical sequence, then a greeting in 3 dominant galactic languages, then a request for identification. Clean, professional. It gave the other side a chance to respond in a way that didn't involve weapons fire. The response had come back in one of those galactic languages, spoken with a human accent that was slightly flat and clipped, a calm voice, female. He believed by the structure of the sound. She had identified the ship as the UES Iron Meridian, a warship of the United Earth sovereignty. She had acknowledged the Vreth Dominion's presence. She had expressed no alarm. That was when Jakoth had decided to run a deep scan. It was standard procedure before boarding a vessel, which was what he planned to do, since a single human ship in Vreth claimed territory was technically a violation that gave him full authority to act. He always ran a complete scan. He wanted to know what he was dealing with. He wanted to know the ship's power levels, its weapon systems, its crew count, its structural weaknesses. It made the boarding cleaner. It made the whole thing more efficient. He had called for Prith. Sensor analyst. Prith was not a soldier. He was a technician, which in the Vreth military hierarchy placed him several rungs below the officers and commanders, but several rungs above the maintenance crews. He was younger than most people on the bridge, with the narrower frame that came from spending most of one's career sitting at a console rather than training in the physical conditioning programs. His eyes were a darker shade than Jakoth's, almost navy blue, and they moved quickly, always processing, always reading. He was the best scanner operator in the fleet, which was the only reason Jakoth tolerated his occasional habit of asking questions before acting on orders. Prith had set up the deep scan array. Without comment, he understood what was being asked of him. He pulled the array's power draw up to full capacity, aligned the sensor clusters with the drifting human ship, and began the process. A deep scan was not like a simple radar sweep. It didn't just bounce a signal off the surface and measure what came back. It pushed focused energy through a vessel's hull in waves, each wave tuned to a different frequency, each one designed to reveal a different type of information: hull composition, internal structure, power systems, life signs, weapon loads, engine configuration. It was in effect a complete and total examination of everything a ship was and everything it contained. It took time. For a vessel the size of the Iron Meridian, a thorough deep scan would take somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. Prith started the timer and watched his screens. Subcommander Varak stood a few meters away watching Prith work. Varak was older than most of the bridge crew, with the thick neck and heavy jaw of someone who had come up through ground combat before transitioning to fleet service. He was not a thinker in the way that Prith was a thinker, but he was sharp, and he noticed things that other people missed. He had noticed, for example, that the human ship had not reacted at all when the scan array powered up. Most vessels, even friendly ones, registered some kind of response when they were being deep scanned. It was like being stared at in a room full of people. You usually felt it. The Iron Meridian did not seem to feel it. Or Verac thought it felt it and simply did not care. He kept that thought to himself. Jacob didn't like unnecessary commentary. During operations, on the bridge of the Iron Meridian, Commander Alara Voss sat in her command chair and listened to her ship breathe. Every ship had a sound. The Iron Meridian sound was a low, constant vibration that came up through the chair, through the floor, through the walls, the sound of the three fusion cores running at idle, the sound of the life support cycling, the sound of nearly 2,000 people going about their duties in the disciplined, quiet way that long service in deep space tended to produce. It was a sound Voss had lived with for 11 years on various ships, and she found it more comforting than silence. She was not a tall woman. She was average height for a human, lean rather than broad, with dark brown skin and close-cut natural hair that she kept neat because regulation required it and because she had never much cared for fussing with it. Her eyes were a very ordinary brown. She was 43 years old. She had the kind of face that didn't give much away, not because she was hiding things, but because she had long ago learned that a commander's expression was something the crew watched constantly, and there was no point in frightening people with your own uncertainty. She had been watching the Vreth Armada since it dropped out of faster-than-light transit 6 hours ago. 7 ships, she had counted them carefully. She had run her own passive scans, nothing that would provoke them, just the standard electromagnetic reads that any ship did automatically, and she had built a picture of what she was looking at. The Vreth flagship alone was almost 4 times the length of the Iron Meridian. The 6 escort vessels were each roughly equivalent to her ship in size, maybe slightly larger. All 7 were armed. All 7 had their weapon systems in a standby configuration, not fully charged but not fully cold either. Ready but waiting. She had received the hailing signal and responded to it. She had kept her voice even and her words simple. She had given her ship's name and her government's name, and she had not asked what the Vreth wanted because it was fairly obvious what they wanted. They wanted her to leave. She was not going to leave. Her orders were specific. She was in the Hellion corridor because Admiral Harkin had put her there on purpose. The Vreth had been expanding their claimed territory in slow, careful increments for the past decade, pushing their borders a little further each year into space that no formal treaty had assigned to anyone. They did it quietly, one system at a time, waiting to see if anyone pushed back. Most species didn't. Most species saw the size of the Vreth dominion and decided that the corridor or the system or the planet wasn't worth the argument. Harkin had decided it was time to push back, not with aggression, not with a declaration, just with presence, just with the simple physical fact of a human warship sitting in the space that the Vreth were quietly claiming and not moving when asked, and then letting them scan it. That part of the order had surprised Voss when Harkin first gave it. She had sat across from the Admiral in his office on Earth Station 1 and listened to him lay out the mission, and when he got to the part about allowing a full deep scan without raising shields or initiating any countermeasures, she had said simply and clearly, "Sir, that will show them everything." Harkin had looked at her for a moment before answering. He was a big man, older, with gray in his hair and the kind of quiet that came from having made very hard decisions over a very long career. He had nodded slowly and said, yes. That was the point. She had wanted to ask more questions. She had about 6 of them lined up behind her teeth, but something in the way he'd said it, the complete unhurried certainty of it, had made her close her mouth and sit with it for a moment, and the longer she sat with it, the more she began to understand. The Vreth had spent 3 centuries building a reputation. The reputation was the weapon. You didn't have to fight every species, you just had to make sure every species knew what had happened to the ones you had fought. The reputation did the rest. Humanity was building a reputation too. It was just a different kind. Voss opened a ship-wide channel. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The system carried sound perfectly. Well, she said, let them look. All of it. And then she closed the channel and settled back in her chair and listened to our ship breathe and waited. On the endless dominion, the deep scan continued. Data moved across Prith's screens in slow, steady columns. Hull composition results first. That was always the quickest layer to read. Prith had run this scan on dozens of vessels over his career, from tiny mining ships to full military cruisers. He knew what the numbers usually looked like. He knew the standard ranges. He looked at the first set of numbers coming back from the iron meridians. Hull analysis. He looked at them for a long moment. He ran the calibration check on his instruments because he was a careful technician, and the first thing you did when you got a number that didn't fit your expectations was check that your instruments were reading correctly. The calibration check came back clean. The instruments were fine. He looked at the numbers again. They were not fine. He didn't say anything yet. He was a technician, not an officer. It wasn't his place to say anything until he had more data. He set a flag on the hull composition results and moved to the next layer of the scan, telling himself that there was probably an explanation, that the numbers were unusual but not necessarily alarming, that he should wait for the full picture before drawing any conclusions. He moved to the weapons array data, and the next set of numbers started coming in. He set another flag. Varrock, watching from a few meters away, saw the small, barely visible change in Prith's posture. The technician's back had straightened slightly. His lower pair of hands, which had been resting loose on the edge of the console, had curled their fingers inward, just slightly, just barely, the kind of thing that most people would not notice. Varrock noticed it. He moved a step closer and looked at Prith's screen, and even though he was not a scanner specialist and the data on the screen was not laid out in a way that was immediately readable to him, he could see the flagged markers accumulating in the corner of the display. 1, 2, now 3. He looked through the viewport at the human ship. It was still drifting, still calm, still doing nothing. Jacob was standing near the forward viewport, watching his armadas positioning on a secondary display. 6 of his ships had arranged themselves in a loose arc around the human vessel. Not a full encirclement, but enough to communicate the nature of the situation without being formally aggressive. It was a posture he had used many times. It said, you are surrounded, you are outgunned, make the right choice. He had not looked at Prith's screens. The scan was ongoing. He would review the results when they were complete, as he always did, thorough and orderly. He believed in doing things in the right Sequencer. He did not notice at first that Prith had gone very quiet. The scan continued, the data came in, and with each new layer of information that the deep scan array pulled from the bones of the iron meridian, Prith's hands grew more still, and the flags in the corner of his screen multiplied, and the cold feeling that had started in the base of his neck began moving slowly upward toward the back of his skull. He reached the biological readings, the life sign data, the crew metrics, and the cold feeling reached his eyes. The scan showed 1,847 humans aboard the Iron Meridian. It showed their locations within the ship, their movement patterns, their basic physiological data, and because Prith's scanner array was a military-grade system designed for threat assessment, it also measured something else, the hormonal and neurological markers associated with stress. In every other species Prith had ever scanned during a military standoff, those markers looked a specific way. Fear, panic, the biology of a creature that knew it was in danger and was trying to decide whether to run or fight. It was readable, it was predictable, it was in a strange way reassuring because it meant the other side understood the situation the same way you did. The human readings did not look like that. 1,847 human beings surrounded by 7 Vreth warships, deep scan without their permission, in a ship sitting alone in the dark, millions of miles from anyone who could help them, and their biological readings showed something that Prith's scanner system could not categorize. He stared at the readout. The system was trying to classify it, running it against every category in its database. Fear no match, panic no match, aggression no match, exhaustion no match, chemical sedation no match. The system cycled through its entire library. Then it stopped and produced 2 words in the output box: classification unknown. Prith sat very still for a moment. Then he turned to look for the Admiral. Fleet Admiral, he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended and with a small tremor in it that he had not planned and could not entirely explain. Jacketh turned from the viewport. He saw the look on Prith's face, the careful, controlled look of a technician who had found something he did not know how to explain, and he crossed the bridge. Long measured strides. He looked at the screen. The bridge of the endless dominion was not a quiet place under normal circumstances. There were dozens of officers and crew at their stations, monitoring systems running, calculations, communicating with the rest of the armada. There was always sound, always movement. Jacketh read the screen, and then he read it again, and then he stood very still, and somehow the stillness of one man changed the atmosphere of the entire room. People noticed. They always noticed when the Admiral went still, slowly, without anyone giving an order. The bridge got quieter. Through the viewport, the Iron Meridian drifted on, steady and calm, its amber running lights blinking in that slow, unhurried rhythm, as if it had nowhere else to be and no reason to hurry, as if it were waiting for them to finish, as if it had known before the scan even started exactly what they would find and exactly what it would feel like when they found it. Varric stepped up beside the Admiral and looked at the screen. He read the numbers, he read the flags, he read the 2 words in the output box. He said nothing. He looked out at the human ship. The scan was not yet complete. There were more layers to go. more data still to come. For the first time in 14 years of fleet service, Sub-Commander Varek found himself not entirely sure he wanted to see what came next. The scan kept running. Prith stayed at his console. He had not moved from his seat in over 20 minutes, which was unusual for him because he was the kind of person who shifted and fidgeted and leaned forward and back when he was thinking. But right now he was not fidgeting. He was sitting very straight and still, his four hands arranged neatly on the edge of the console, and he was reading the results as they came in the same way a person might read something that they kept hopping with change if they looked at it long enough. It did not change. Fleet Admiral Jacob had pulled a chair from a nearby station and placed it beside Prith's console. He did not usually sit near the scan station. He usually stood at the forward viewport or at the command platform in the center of the bridge. But the forward viewport showed him nothing useful, and the command platform felt in this particular moment like the wrong place to be. He wanted to see the numbers as they arrived. He wanted to see each layer of data as the scan revealed it in real time. Without waiting for a summary, he had asked Prith to walk him through it, explain each section as it came in. Plain language, no technical shorthand. Prith had nodded and begun. The hull composition results had come first, and Prith had explained them quietly, his voice careful and measured, the voice of someone who was being very deliberate about keeping emotion out of his words. The Iron Meridian's outer hull was not a single material. Most ships used one primary alloy, maybe two, in areas where extra strength was needed. The human ship used 17 different materials, all interlocked at a structural level, each one chosen because of how it behaved in relation to the others. Some were standard metals and composites that the Vreth recognized, others were not in any Vreth materials database. What the scan could determine from the way the materials interacted with the scan's test frequencies was that the outer hull was not passive armor. It did not simply sit there and absorb impacts. The outer layer, a composite that the scan could not fully classify, responded to energy input. When the deep scans frequencies passed through it, the material absorbed a portion of that energy and redirected it inward, not randomly in a specific direction, toward the ship's power grid. Jacob had looked at Prith when that result came through. Prith had looked back at him with that same careful, controlled expression. It eats weapons fire, Prith said, because there was no simpler way to say it, or at least part of it. The directed energy that hits the outer layer, it doesn't just bounce off or damage the hull. Some of it gets absorbed, and then the hull sends it to the ship's power systems. Jacob had said nothing. He had looked at the numbers for a long moment and then gestured for Prith to continue. The second layer of the scan had covered the ship's internal structure, the frame, the bulkheads, the way the ship was put together on the inside. Prith had run this part of the analysis twice, because the first run produced results that seemed inconsistent with what the outer scan had shown, and he wanted to make sure he wasn't misreading the data. He was not misreading it. The Iron Meridian was divided internally into sections that were individually sealed from each other at a structural level, not just doors that could close. Actual physical separation. Each section of the ship could be completely isolated from every other section if the situation required it, the materials in the internal bulkheads were different from the outer hull composite, but they shared one characteristic: the scan suggested they were capable of a limited degree of self-repair. Prith had explained this part slowly, because he understood that what he was saying sounded like something from a story rather than from an engineering report. The hull could, under certain conditions, close small breaches on its own, not large damage. A significant weapon strike would still cause significant damage, but the kind of minor breach that accumulated over the course of a long battle, the small cracks and stress fractures that added up over time and eventually became critical vulnerabilities. The material could address those on its own slowly while the ship was still fighting. Jacketh had asked how that was possible. Prith had said he didn't fully know. The scan could tell him what the material did. It could not tell him with complete certainty how it did it. What he could say was that the structure was unlike anything in Vreth engineering. It was not that the Vreth hadn't thought about self-repairing materials. They had, in theoretical papers and laboratory experiments, but the practical challenges were enormous, and the Vreth had concluded several decades ago that the technology was too complex and too expensive to develop for wide use. The humans had apparently reached a different conclusion. Subcommander Varak had come to stand behind them by this point. He had not been invited, but Jacketh had not told him to leave, which meant he was allowed to stay. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest and read the screen over Prith's shoulder and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. The weapons data was next. Prith had paused before beginning this section, a small pause, barely more than a breath. Then he had straightened his back a little more and started reading the numbers. The Iron Meridian carried 32 primary weapons mass driver cannons arranged in 8 batteries of 4 positioned along the ship's main axis and secondary flanks. The scan had measured the barrel length, the power draw of the electromagnetic coils, the capacity of the ammunition storage systems, and from those measurements it had calculated a performance estimate. Prith read the performance estimate. Then he read it again. Then he said very quietly, each cannon can accelerate a 1-ton tungsten projectile to approximately 4% of the speed of light. Jacketh said, repeat that. Prith repeated it. 4% of the speed of light. That was not a speed that weapons were supposed to travel at. That was not a speed that weapons practically could travel at, given the engineering involved in the acceleration process, given the power requirements, given the structural stress on the barrel and the frame of the ship during firing. The VRF's own mass driver technology, which was considered advanced, operate at a fraction of that velocity. Their best weapons moved projectiles at roughly 0.5% of light speed, and that required enormous power draws and had a low rate of fire because the systems needed time to recover between shots. The human cannons, if the scan's estimate was correct, fired at 8 times that velocity. Prith did the math out loud because math made things feel more real and more manageable than raw numbers. And also because he needed something to do with his hands and his voice while his mind tried to settle. At 4% of light speed, a 1-ton tungsten slug carried kinetic energy measured the equivalent of many thousands of Nuclear warheads, one shot from one cannon. The Iron Meridian had 32 of them. The combined kinetic yield of a single broadside from the Iron Meridian, all cannons firing at once, exceeded the total firepower of Jacketh's entire 7-ship armada by a significant margin. Varric made a sound. It was not a word. It was just a sound, the kind that comes out of a person when their mind has tried to process something and briefly run out of room. Jacketh did not make a sound. He sat very still and looked at the screen. And then he said, "The power source." Prith nodded. He had already moved to that section of the scan. 3 fusion cores, he said, each one independent of the others. If one is destroyed, the remaining 2 don't lose power. They increase output and redistribute the load automatically. The switchover time is approximately 1 second. 1 second. In a battle, 1 second was nothing. In 1 second, a ship was either winning or losing or dead, and 1 second of vulnerability in a power system was, in practical terms, no vulnerability at all. Each core can sustain the weapons array at full firing capacity indefinitely. Prith continued, not for a few shots, not for a limited engagement window. Indefinitely, as long as the reactor fuel supply holds, which the scan estimates at. He checked the number twice. Approximately 4 years of continuous combat operation. No one on the bridge said anything for a moment. The ambient sounds of the ship continued, the hum of systems, the soft tones of instruments, the distant movement of crew in other sections of the vessel. But in the immediate space around Jacketh's chair and Prith's console, there was a silence that was separate from all of that. A focused, concentrated silence. Prith moved on. He had more to cover. The scan's biological data had been partially revealed earlier. The crew count, the strange hormonal readings, the classification unknown result. Now the full biological report was complete, and Prith walked through it in the same careful, methodical way he had walked through everything else. 1,847 humans. Their distribution within the ship showed that the crew was at battle stations, not relaxed stations, not normal duty rotations, but the configuration associated with a crew that was fully deployed and ready to act. Every weapon station was manned. Every engineering post was occupied. The bridge complement was complete. The damage control teams were positioned at predesignated response points throughout the ship. This was a crew that was ready to fight. And yet the hormonal readings said they were calm, not drugged, calm, not forced. Calm, just calm. The scan's bioanalysis system was designed to assess threat levels by measuring the biological markers of stress. High stress meant a crew that was reactive, unpredictable, likely to make mistakes. Low stress in a non-combat situation was normal. Low stress in a situation like this one, surrounded, outgunned, deep scan without consent, was not supposed to exist. The human stress markers were low. Their neurological activity was elevated, which was consistent with focus and awareness, but the fear markers, the specific biological signals that every known species produce when facing mortal danger, were minimal. Present but minimal. The kind of low-level biological readiness that was closer to athletic preparation than panic. They were treating this, their biology said, the way a person treats something they have prepared for and are ready to Handle. Prith stared at that readout for a long moment before moving on. He moved to the final section of the scan, the one that had taken the longest to process because the scanner system had encountered materials it needed extra time to analyze. The sealed lower decks. The Iron Meridian had a section of its lower hull that was shielded differently from the rest of the ship, not with the outer composite, with something else. Something denser, something that the scan had needed several passes to fully penetrate. The shielding itself told a story. Whatever was inside those lower decks was something the designers of this ship had specifically decided to protect from outside observation. The scan had eventually gotten through. Prith read the contents list, then he put his hands flat on the console and took a slow breath. The sealed lower decks contained an armory, not a standard weapon storage bay. The Iron Meridian standard munitions were accounted for elsewhere. This was a secondary armory, separate from the ship's main weapon systems, and it contained warheads. Not standard warheads, not the nuclear devices or the antimatter charges that the Vreth used and that most militaries in the known galaxy had developed. These were something else. The scan had identified the physical structure and the energy signature, and Prith's instruments had compared them against every known weapons classification in the Dominion's database. No match. What the scan could determine was that the energy contained in those warheads was significant, extremely significant. The kind of energy reading that, in the Vreth's own theoretical physics research that Prith had a passing familiarity with because he had studied advanced physics before joining the military, was associated with a type of spatial disruption weapon, a weapon that did not simply destroy matter but interfered with the physical structure of space itself in a localized area. The Vreth had theorized about weapons. Several papers had been written. The general scientific consensus had been that while the principle was sound, the technology required to miniaturize such a device to a deliverable warhead size was beyond current engineering capabilities, maybe a century away from being practical, maybe more. The Iron Meridian carried 47 of them. Prith stopped reading. He sat at his console and looked at his screen and did not say anything for a moment because he had run out of the careful, methodical, controlled way of presenting information and needed a second to find it again. Jacketh was looking at the screen too. His pale eyes moved slowly across the data. His expression had not changed. It was still that flat, controlled look that had made him famous throughout the Dominion, the look that said he was processing and not yet deciding, but something had changed around his eyes. Something that was not quite in expression but was in the territory of a tightness, a stillness behind the stillness. Varric had stopped crossing his arms. He had let them fall to his sides, and he was standing with his hands slightly open, which was the posture of a person who had unconsciously let go of a confident stance because the confidence had somewhere else to be. The scan was complete. The full report sat on Prith's screen, organized in the neat columns and categories that the system always used. All of it formatted with the clean, professional layout of a military intelligence document: hull composition, internal structure, weapons array, power systems, crew biometrics, secondary armament, all of it adding up to a picture that Prith had not expected to see when he began this scan 30 minutes ago. He had expected a primitive ship. He had expected numbers that were behind Vreth technology. He had expected to write a scan report that confirmed what everyone already assumed, that this human vessel was smaller, weaker, less capable, and that its presence in the corridor was the mistake of a young species that didn't know its place in the hierarchy of galactic power. He had expected to feel reassured after the scan. He did not feel reassured. The bridge of the endless dominion was quiet now. The ambient sounds were still there. The ship was still running, still functioning, all its systems still doing what they were supposed to do. But the people near the scan station were not making any sounds of their own. They were just there in that silence, looking at the screen, or looking at the human ship through the viewport, or looking at each other. Prith thought about the classification. Unknown result on the cruise stress readings. He thought about 1,847 humans sitting in that ship, calm and ready, having allowed the scan to happen, having been told clearly to let the Vreth look at everything. They had known what the scan would find. They had known what it would show, and they had let it happen anyway. He thought about what that meant. If you let someone see your full strength, all of it, every layer, every weapon, every capability, there were really only two reasons to do it. Either you were making a mistake and didn't realize how much you were showing, or you were showing it on purpose because you wanted the other side to know, because you wanted them to feel exactly what Prith was feeling right now. He turned to look at Fleet Admiral Jaketh, conqueror of 11 systems, the man who had never lost an engagement, who had made 3 species kneel in a race. 2 others who had come to this corridor with 7 ships because one human ship alone in the dark seemed like a simple problem. Jaketh was still looking at the screen. He had not given any orders. In 31 years, Prith imagined the Admiral had always given orders quickly after a scan, assess, decide, act. That was the Vreth military way. That was Jaketh's way especially. He was not a man who hesitated. He was hesitating now. Prith looked back at his screen, at the report, at the numbers, at the 2 words in the corner of the biological analysis section. Classification unknown. Outside the viewport, the iron meridian drifted on, amber lights blinking steady and slow, waiting with that terrible patience, as if it had all the time in the universe and knew exactly how this was going to end. Jaketh stood up. He did it slowly, the way a person stands up when they need to move but haven't decided where they're going yet. He stepped away from Prith's console. He walked to the forward viewport and stood in front of it with his upper hands clasped behind his back and his lower hands at his sides, and he looked at the iron meridian. It looked the same as it had for the past several hours, drifting still, running lights blinking. He stood there for almost 3 minutes without saying anything, and nobody on the bridge said anything either, because the Admiral was thinking and the whole room knew it. And when Jaketh was thinking, you stayed quiet and you waited. Then he turned from the viewport and looked at his intelligence officer. Lieutenant Soth was a slim Vreth woman who ran the flagship's intelligence division with a kind of quiet efficiency that made her easy to overlook and very difficult to replace. She was standing near her station on the left side of the bridge, watching the Admiral the same way everyone else was watching him. Everything we have on the humans. Jacketh said, all of it, pull it now. Soth nodded and went to work. It took her 11 minutes to compile the full intelligence file on humanity. 11 minutes because the Dominion had not invested enormous resources in gathering intelligence on a species that was only 80 years into space travel and that everyone had assumed posed no strategic threat for at least another century. There was a file. It was not as thick as the files on the species that had actually given the Vreth trouble. She put the file on the main display in the center of the bridge where everyone could see it, and she walked the Admiral through it. The first section was history. Human history, as best as the Vreth had been able to piece it together from intercepted communications from the databases of other species who had made contact with Earth before the Vreth, and from a small number of direct information exchanges that had happened in the early period of human expansion into space. Jacketh read it. He read it carefully, though. Way he read everything, not quickly scanning, but moving through it methodically, taking in each part before moving to the next. Human civilization, the file said, was approximately 10,000 years old by their own calendar, 10,000 years from the first permanent settlements to the current day. The Vreth Dominion, for comparison, had a documented history of roughly 6,000 years. The Vreth considered themselves an old species, mature, seasoned, having learned over those 6,000 years how to organize, how to govern, how to project power across space. 10,000 years of human history. Jacketh read about what had filled those 10,000 years. War. Not occasional war, not the disciplined strategic military campaigns that the Vreth engaged in when expansion required it. Constant war, relentless, inventive, ever-escalating war between human groups, human nations, human ideologies, human religions, human economic systems. War fought with stones, then with metal, then with explosives, then with weapons that could level entire cities in a single strike, then with weapons that could, if enough of them were used, end all life on their planet. They had built those last weapons. The file was clear on this. Humanity had developed devices capable of planetary-scale destruction and had pointed them at each other, had lived for a significant portion of their recent history in a state where the complete annihilation of their species was one bad decision away. And then they had not destroyed themselves, not because they suddenly became peaceful. The file was clear on this. 2, they had not stopped being a species that produced conflict and competition and the willingness to use force. They had simply, and this was the word that Soth used when she summarized this section, and Jacketh turned it over in his mind for a long moment. Redirected. The internal conflicts had not gone away. They had changed form, and the energy, the drive, the enormous collective force of a species that had spent 10,000 years finding ways to defeat, outmaneuver, and outlast enemies. That force had been pointed outward into space. Continue, Jacketh said. The second section of the file covered humanity's military development since they achieved faster-than-light travel. 80 years. The Vreth had spent those 80 years largely dismissing humanity as a problem for future generations to manage. Other intelligence divisions, other empires had done the same. The file contained notes from 3 separate Vreth intelligence assessments. conducted over the past 50 years, all of which had concluded that humanity's military capability was developing but slowly, and that their technology was significantly behind the Dominion standard. The most recent of those assessments was 12 years old. Jakoth looked at the date for a moment. 12 years, he had not commissioned a new one because the situation had not seemed urgent enough to require it. Humanity was young, they would take time to develop, there was no rush. He thought about what 12 years had apparently been enough time for humanity to do. The third section covered the Iron Meridian specifically, not just the ship itself, but its class, the Vanguard class. The Dominion had known the class existed. They had intercepted enough communications to know the name. What they had not known or had not prioritized finding out was the production numbers. Soth read the number from the file. Her voice was steady and professional. The way voices are when a person has decided that this is a job and they are going to do it well regardless of how the information lands. The Iron Meridian was hull number 412 in the Vanguard class. Jakoth looked at her. She looked back at him with the steady, careful expression of someone who has already processed the implications and is now waiting for the person in charge to do the same. 412 ships, 412 vessels of the same class as the one sitting outside with the same hull composite, the same weapons array, the same triple redundant reactors, the same impossible kinetic yield per broadside, and those were just the ones that had been built. The file suggested that production was ongoing. The exact current number was unknown because the Dominion's intelligence on human shipyard capacity was incomplete. But 412 was the minimum. Varric, still standing behind Jakoth, had gone very still. Jakoth did not need to look at him to know this. He could feel the stillness in the room behind him. The classification levels, Jakoth said. Above Vanguard, what do we have? Soth pulled up the relevant section, the Dominion's file on human military classifications was incomplete. They had not been paying close enough attention for long enough to build a full picture. But some intercepted communications and from data shared by other species who had been monitoring humanity's development more carefully than they Vreth had. They had identified 4 distinct classification levels above Vanguard. Vanguard was not their best warship. Vanguard was a mid-tier patrol and escort vessel. There were 4 classes above it. File had incomplete data on 2 of them. The other 2 it knew almost nothing about except their names and the fact that they existed. Jakoth moved to the viewport again. He stood there and looked at the Iron Meridian and thought about mid-tier. He thought about that word in the specific way that a military commander thinks about information that changes the fundamental nature of a situation. He was a man who dealt in realities. He did not comfort himself with hopeful interpretations. He dealt in what was. What was this? He had brought 7 ships to intimidate a single human patrol vessel, and the patrol vessel was a mid-tier asset. He thought about what a non-mid-tier human vessel might look like, and he decided after a moment that he would prefer not to find out the hard way. On the Iron Meridian, in the hours following the scan, Commander Alara Voss received a brief communication from Admiral Harkin via the secure relay. It had been routed through 3 intermediate stations to keep the signal profile low. It said simply, the scan is complete. Any response from the VREF? Voss had replied, not yet, waiting. Harkin's next message came back in minutes. It said, good, let them think. Give them time, they'll reach the right conclusion on their own if you give them space to do it. Voss had read that message and then looked out at the VREF Armada and thought about the mission briefing, the one where she had asked Harkin why they would let the enemy see everything. And Harkin had answered with the thing about the best weapon not being on the ship. She had thought about that answer a lot since then, on the transit out to the Hellion corridor in the quiet hours before the VREF Armada had arrived. She had sat in her ready room and turned it over in her mind, examining it the way you examine a decision you've been asked to make someone else's decision, looking for the part she disagreed with. She hadn't found it. The logic was clean. The VREF operated on reputation. They had built their empire on it, the reputation of overwhelming force, of certain consequences, of a hierarchy that had a clear and predictable top. When you face the VREF, you knew exactly how much worse your situation could get. That knowledge was the weapon. It made most species capitulate before a shot was fired. Humanity was building a different kind of reputation, not the reputation of a species that destroyed everything it touched, the reputation of a species that had thought very carefully about how much force it had developed, considerably more than anyone expected, and this was the key part, the part that Harkin had explained with that quiet certainty of his, was not showing you its maximum, was always keeping something in reserve. You could fight a known quantity, you could plan against a specific threat level, you could calculate whether you could win against a force you had fully measured. You could not plan against an unknown upper limit. If every time you looked at humanity's military you saw something larger and more capable than you expected, then the question was never, can we beat what we see? The question became, how much more is there that we can't see? That question, once it was in your head, was very hard to get out. Voss had understood this in the briefing room on Earth Station 1, sitting across from Harkin, but she understood it differently now. She understood it the way you understand a thing when it is actually happening rather than when it is being explained. She understood it in the silence coming from the VREF Armada, in the fact that none of their weapons had charged since the scan completed, in the fact that they were just sitting there, 7 large and powerful ships doing nothing, thinking. She had told her crew to stand easy, not to stand down. She was not naive, but to ease the tension, to eat, to rotate rest shifts, to take care of the human things that a crew needed to take care of. During a long standoff, she did not want her people exhausted and frayed when the actual conversation began. Because there would be a conversation. She was fairly certain of that now. The Iron Meridian had a crew of 1,847 people, and those people were in the way of people who have trained together for a long time and understand each other well, very good at reading the mood of a situation. They had been watching the VREF Armada since it arrived. They had noticed the scan. They had noticed the long silence after the scan. They knew what the silence meant. Not because they had been told, but because human beings are a species that has spent 10,000 years reading silences and understanding what they mean in the context of power and danger and decision. The silence meant the Vreth were scared. Not panicked, not broken, but scared in the specific way that a very powerful thing becomes scared when it encounters something that is more powerful than it expected and has to decide what to do about that. Most of the crew didn't celebrate this. They didn't congratulate each other. They just went about their duties with a slight loosening around the eyes and the jaw, the biological equivalent of exhaling. That meant the worst case scenario was looking less likely than it had an hour ago. A young weapons officer named Dario had asked his shift supervisor quietly whether they were going to have to fight. The supervisor, an older woman named Chen, who had been in deep space service for 16 years, had looked out at the Vreth Armada for a moment before answering. "No," she said, "I don't think so." "How can you tell?" "Because they stopped moving," Chen said. "A species that's decided to fight doesn't stop and sit still for this long. They're figuring out what they're going to say to us." Dario had thought about that. What are they going to say? Chen had shrugged. Doesn't really matter, does it? The important conversation already happened. Back on the Endless Dominion, the important conversation was, in fact, still happening, just not out loud. Jacob had dismissed most of the bridge crew to secondary duties. He kept Prith, Varak, and Soth. He needed thinkers. Right now, not soldiers. He needed people who could help him understand something, because he was a man who had never needed to understand this specific kind of thing before, and he was aware that the way he handled the next few hours would define not just this encounter but the Dominion's relationship with humanity for years. He had sat down at the main strategy table and spread the intelligence file out in front of him and looked at it as a whole rather than in parts. He was trying to find the hole in it, the part that was wrong or overstated or misread. Every intelligence report had a weakness. Every set of numbers had an assumption behind it. Scan data was very reliable, but it was not perfect. Maybe the scan had misread the hull composition. Maybe the weapons performance estimate was based on a flawed extrapolation. Maybe the production numbers were inflated. He spent an hour looking for those mistakes. He found some small ones. The scans estimate on the kinetic yield of the mass drivers had a margin of error that could, in the optimistic interpretation, make the actual numbers somewhat lower than what was reported. The production figure of 412 was a minimum, and the actual current number might be lower if production had slowed. But the gap between these optimistic corrections and the situation being manageable was still enormous, even if every number was wrong by 20% in the direction he would prefer. He was still looking at a single human patrol ship that could destroy his entire armada and withstand the armada's return fire, backed by hundreds of identical ships and an unknown number of ships above that class. And they had let him see all of this on purpose. That was the part that kept coming back to him. Not the capability. Capability was just engineering, just resources, just the accumulated output of a species. Technical development, capability could be matched in time if you worked at it. It was enormous, and it was unexpected. But it was not in itself what was keeping him standing at the viewport, rather than making decisions. What was keeping him there was the Joyce. They had chosen to let him look. They had decided at some level of their command structure that showing him everything was better than hiding it. That the knowledge of what the iron meridian was and what was behind it would accomplish more than any amount of secrecy or maneuvering. That was not the choice of a species that was afraid of him. That was the choice of a species that had calculated the outcome of this encounter well in advance and was comfortable with all the possible results. A species that had looked at a Vreth armada and thought, let them scan us. Let them see, let them understand, and then let's see what they decide. A species that had then sent a single ship to sit in the corridor and wait, without shields raised, without weapons, charged with 1,847 calm, ready people aboard. Jacka thought about the 10,000 years in the intelligence file, the wars, the weapons capable of ending their own civilization, the decision at some point to point all of that energy outward. He thought about what it meant that they had survived all of that, that they had walked through 10,000 years of the kind of internal conflict that had destroyed other species. He knew of 3 that had gone extinct through their own warfare, 3 that had reduced themselves to pre-technological levels and had come out on the other side, scarred probably, changed certainly, but intact and still hungry. That was the word that came to him, standing at the viewport, looking at the patient, steady blink of the iron meridian's running lights. Still hungry. He turned to Varric. If we fire on that ship, he said, not as a plan but as a calculation, and we somehow disable it before it destroys us, which the scan suggests we almost certainly cannot do, but let's suppose. What happens next? Varric answered without hesitating, because he had already done this calculation. 411 more ships of the same class, he said, minimum, plus whatever is above that class, plus whatever political response a military action against their vessel generates from their government, plus whatever other species they have relationships with who would treat an attack on a human ship as an invitation to reassess their own relationship with the Dominion. Jacketh nodded. He had done the same calculation and reached the same place. And if we do nothing, he said, if we simply leave. Varric thought about this one longer. Then they have successfully demonstrated that we won't fire on them, that the corridor is accessible to them, and word of this encounter will spread, because it always does. Every species watching the Dominions borders will hear that the Vreth arrived in force and then left without action, which tells them that the Dominion has found a reason not to act, Jakov said. Yes, which tells them there are things the Dominion is afraid of. A pause. Yes, Varric said again. Jakov looked at the iron meridian. There was a third option. There was always a third option, and it was the one that a species with 10,000 years of conflict and an unknown number of warships above Vanguard class had apparently been hoping he would reach. He walked back to the communication station. Open a channel to the human ship, he said. The operator opened the channel. Jakov stood in front of the communications display and thought for a moment about what he was going to say, and about what it meant that he was saying it, and about the particular feeling of being a man who had spent 31 years as the most dangerous thing in every room he had ever entered, and who was now standing in a room where that was no longer true. He found to his surprise that he was able to bear it. He began to speak. The communication request came through on a standard VREF military frequency. VASIS communications officer, a young man named Reyes, who had the unhurried, practiced manner of someone who had been routing signals in high-pressure situations for long enough that nothing surprised him anymore. Flagged it immediately and turned to look at the commander. VREF flagship is requesting an open channel, commander, he said, audio and visual. Voss looked at the time display on her console. 47 minutes had passed since the scan completed. She had been sitting in her chair for most of that time, reviewing crew reports, signing off on maintenance logs, doing the ordinary administrative work of running a ship. Because there was always ordinary administrative work, and because doing it kept her grounded in the normal texture of her job. It also sent a message to her crew. If the commander is reviewing maintenance reports, the situation has not escalated to the point where we should be alarmed. She closed the maintenance log. Accept the channel, she said. Full display, let's give them the bridge. Reyes brought the channel up. The main display on the forward section of the Iron Meridian's bridge, a wide screen that normally showed navigation data and sensor readouts, shifted to show the interior of the VREF flagship's bridge. And on the VREF flagship, the equivalent screen would now be showing the Iron Meridian's bridge in return. Voss took a moment to look at what she was seeing. The VREF bridge was larger than hers. High ceilings, wide floor space, the kind of scale that said this is a vessel built by a civilization that expects to be looked at and expects to be impressive. The crew stations were arranged in a pattern that spread outward from a central platform, and on that platform stood the admiral. She had seen images of Jacob in the intelligence files. The reality was not so different. Tall, gray-blue skin, pale eyes, 4 arms, the kind of face that had spent a long time being the face of absolute authority and had settled into that expression permanently. He wore the dark uniform of a VREF fleet admiral, and he stood on his platform with the lower pair of arms at his sides and the upper pair loosely clasped in front of him, which she had read in the cultural notes was a neutral posture. Not aggressive, not submissive, neutral. He was choosing his body language carefully. She noticed that. She heard him begin to speak in VREF. Then she responded in VREF. The slight pause on the other end of the channel was small, but it was there, and she noted it the way she noted everything, without reaction, filing it in the part of her mind that was always cataloging useful information. She had spent 8 months learning functional VREF after receiving the mission assignment. It was not a comfortable language for a human vocal structure. Some of the tonal components were difficult, and she knew her accent was not good, but she was understandable. And understandable was what mattered. Fleet Admiral, she said. Her voice was the same as it always was, even measured, not warm but not cold. The voice of someone who is neither trying to comfort you nor trying to threaten you. I understand the scan has been completed. Jacketh looked at her on his display for a moment before responding. It has, he said. I hope it was useful, Vass said. Another small pause. Informative, he said. She let that word sit in the air between them for a moment, the way you let a Words sit when both parties know it. Contains more than it appears to. Good, she said. Then she let the silence continue for a few more seconds because silence in a conversation like this one was not empty. It was a surface on which the other party had to decide what to do. And what they chose to do with it told you something about where they were. She watched Jacquet's face on the screen. He was not uncomfortable with the silence. He was processing it the same way she was. That told her something about him, that he was experienced and controlled, and not going to make a move that he hadn't thought through. Commander Voss, he said, and she was aware that he was using her name and her rank, both of which he had clearly looked up before opening the channel, and both of which were small signals. That said, I have done my research and I am treating you as a peer. You are in a section of space that the Vreth Dominion considers part of its territory. I'm aware of the Dominion's position on that, she said. We don't share it. No, he said, I gathered that. The Hellion corridor hasn't been formally assigned to anyone, she said. Our government's position is that it's open space. We'll continue to use it on that basis. Jacquet looked at her for a moment. She could not fully read his expression. Vreth facial signaling was different enough from human signaling that she was working with incomplete information, but she could see that he was doing what she was doing, calculating, reading the situation, deciding what was real. You allowed the scan, he said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation being offered as the beginning of something. She recognized the shape of it. Yes, she said, without raising shields, without any countermeasures. Yes. Why? She had anticipated this question. She had thought about several ways to answer it on the long transit out to the Hellion corridor in the quiet hours before his armada arrived, in the 47 minutes of silence after the scan. She had considered answers that were strategic, answers that were diplomatic, answers that were deflections dressed up as answers. She had decided in the end to give him the true one. Because I was ordered to, she said. He looked at her. And because the order made sense, she added. He was quiet for a moment. On his bridge, she could see the figures of his officers at their stations, all of them facing forward, all of them pretending, with varying degrees of success, that they were attending to their duties, rather than listening to this conversation. Your superiors wanted us to see what we saw, he said. Yes. They sent you here knowing we would scan the ship. Yes. He absorbed this. He was doing it in that same careful, methodical way that she had decided was probably just his baseline way of processing information, thoroughly, without rushing, without letting himself get ahead of the data. There are more ships, he said, like this one. She did not confirm or deny this. She simply looked at him with that even, neutral expression and waited. He seemed to accept the silence as its own kind of answer. Commander Voss, he said, and there was something different in his voice now. Not softer, not that, but more deliberate. The voice of a man who has made a decision and is now carrying it out with the professionalism that 31 years of service had built into him. I would like to know what your government considers to be an acceptable arrangement regarding the Hellion corridor. She had been waiting for some version of this question. This was the real conversation, everything before it had been the corridor leading here. That's a discussion for diplomats, she said, not for a ship commander and a fleet admiral in the middle of the corridor itself. Agreed, he said, and she was slightly surprised at how quickly he agreed to that. And then she was not surprised at all, because a man who had spent 31 years making strategic decisions understood perfectly well when a conversation needed to be escalated. But we can begin the discussion, she said, right now on this channel. Informally. He nodded, one slow, deliberate nod. What does your government want? He asked. A boundary, she said, formal agreed upon, with the corridor remaining open to both sides or at minimum to neutral traffic. And in exchange, she said, we don't turn this into a problem. She said it quietly without edge to it, the same even measured tone she had used for the whole conversation, but she watched his eyes as she said it, and she saw the thing she had been watching for, the small, almost invisible shift that told her the words had landed where she intended. On the Vreth Bridge, Sub-Commander Verak stood at his station and listened to the human commander say those words in his language in that calm, unhurried voice, and felt the specific discomfort of a person who was present at a moment that history will later find significant. He looked at the Admiral, Jacques. Expression had not changed, but something in his posture had shifted, very slightly, in a way that Verak, who had served under him for 9 years, recognized. It was the posture of a man who had arrived at the place in a negotiation where the negotiation became real, where you stopped feeling out the other side and started actually deciding. A non-aggression treaty, Jaketh said. Formal boundary in the corridor, open. Transit rights for non-military vessels. That's a starting point, Voss said. It would need to go to the High Council, he said, for ratification. I can recommend, I cannot commit. I understand, she said, I can't commit either, but I can tell you that our government is prepared to discuss these terms and that we consider the discussion worth having. He looked at her for a long moment. And if the High Council rejects the terms, he asked. It was a real question, not a threat. A real question, the kind a serious military commander asked when he was trying to understand the full shape of a situation before reporting on it to his superiors. She looked at him steadily. Then we'd have another conversation. She said, a different kind. She did not gesture toward anything. She did not look at the iron meridians, weapon systems, or wave a hand at the viewport or do anything that could be interpreted as a threat display. She just said it in the same quiet, even voice and looked at him. A different kind of conversation. On the Vreth Bridge, Prith was sitting at his console with the scan results still on his screen. He was not actively working. The scan was complete. The data was filed. There was nothing left for him to do technically. He was sitting there because he could not quite bring himself to leave. He had the feeling, which he recognized as irrational but could not dismiss, that if he left the console, the numbers would somehow change, and he wanted to stay close to the reality of what he had found. He was listening to the conversation between the Admiral and the human commander. He had noticed, almost from the first moment the channel opened, that Commander Voss spoke their language without the careful, textbook formality that most non-Vreth speakers used when they were working from instruction. Her accent was not good. Some of the tones were clearly difficult for her vocal structure, but the phrasing was natural. The word choices were natural. She spoke breath the way a person speaks, a language they have practiced with real speakers, not just with recordings and grammar guides. 8 months, he would later learn, was how long she had had. 8 months to learn a language well enough to conduct a diplomatic negotiation in it without an interpreter in a high-stakes situation, under the kind of pressure that made most people's second language ability collapse. He thought about that. He thought about the 10,000 years in the intelligence file. He thought about a species that had spent all of that time fighting, and in the process had learned not just how to fight, but how to prepare, how to anticipate, how to walk into a situation, knowing what was going to happen before it happened, because they had seen enough versions of situations like this, one to recognize the shape of it. She had known before the Armada arrived that there would be a scan. She had known before the scan started what it would find. She had known before the conversation began what questions the Admiral would ask, because the questions were logical, and she was dealing with a logical commander, and the situation had a shape that she had read before arriving. She had prepared for all of it. 8 months of language study, decision to open the ship to a full scan, the mission itself, one ship sitting in the corridor, demonstrating through pure presence and patience that humanity was comfortable in this space and intended to remain comfortable in it. All of it prepared, all of it calculated, all of it executed by a woman who sat in her chair and reviewed maintenance reports while a Vreth Armada sat outside her ship, because she had done the calculation and was comfortable with where it led. Prith thought about the classification. Unknown result again. The system that had tried to categorize the human crew stress response and come up empty. He thought about what that actually meant, not what the result said, but what the reality it described was. It meant the humans did not have a category for what they were feeling that corresponded to any category that a scanner recognized. It meant that the emotional and biological state of 1,847 people in a ship surrounded by a hostile Armada was something entirely outside his scanner's reference library of known species responses to mortal danger. It meant they were not afraid in any way he could measure. He thought about what kind of species that was. He thought about how a species got to a place where its soldiers, sitting in a lone ship millions of miles from home, surrounded by enemies, were in a biological state that a military scanner couldn't classify because it didn't match any known version of fear. He thought you would have to have done this a lot. You would have to have been in situations like this, or worse enough, times that your body stopped producing the signals it was built to produce for danger, because danger had become the standard operating condition, because your history had made danger the water you swam in. He thought 10,000 years. He thought they survived all of it. On the main display, the conversation between Jaketh and Commander Voss continued. They were discussing in the careful, measured language of two professionals who understood what was at stake and were both committed to not making a mistake. The preliminary terms of a process that would eventually lead through a High Council session, through months of formal diplomatic exchange, through the careful, slow work of people with very different natures trying to Find an arrangement they could both live with, to a treaty, not to a battle, not to another species made to kneel, not to the quiet, clean finality of a species erased, to a conversation, to a process, to the long, imperfect, thoroughly human method of arriving at outcomes by talking about them until something workable emerged. Jacket's posture over the course of the conversation had changed in small ways that Varric noticed, and that probably no one else on the bridge did. The slight tension across his upper shoulders had not disappeared, but it had shifted, changed quality. It had moved from the tension of an unresolved threat, the tension of something you might need to fight, to the tension of a complex problem you were in the process of working through. Different tension, manageable tension. He was, Varric realized, going to recommend the treaty. He had made the calculation and reached the place where the calculation ended. And the place it ended was here. Recommending to the High Council that the Vreth Dominion enter into a formal non-aggression agreement with humanity. Not because humanity had demanded it. Not because humanity had threatened war. Not because humanity had done anything other than sit in the corridor and let itself be seen, and then open a channel and speak plainly in his own language. Because the math was clear. Because the history file was clear. Because the scan was clear. And because, most of all, the calm on Commander Voss's face throughout this conversation, the absolute unbothered, collected calm of a person who had known from the beginning how this was going to go, was the clearest thing of all. On the weapons deck of the Endless Dominion, a young Vreth officer named Dorith had his hand near the primary firing panel. He had been there for the entire duration of the standoff, 3 steps from the panel, watching the status indicators on the targeting systems and waiting for an order. He had not received an order. He had received about 20 minutes ago signal from the bridge telling him to move to standby status, not to stand down, to standby, keep the systems warm, stay at his post. But the level of readiness had been downgraded from active engagement preparation to standby, which was a step back from the edge, a deliberate, calculated step back. He had moved to standby. He stood at his station and watched the iron meridian on his secondary display. The human ship had not moved. Its weapons were not charged. It was just sitting there, being exactly what it was, in the same steady, unhurried way it had been since they arrived. He thought about the scan results. They had filtered down to the weapons team in summary form, the way operational intelligence always did, stripped of some detail, focused on the most actionable points. He had read the summary, he had read the weapons estimates, he had done the same math that everyone else on the ship was quietly doing. He looked at his hand 3 steps from the panel, and then he looked at the iron meridian. He was glad, quietly and privately, and in the specific way of a person who never say this out loud, that the Admiral was talking instead of shooting. He stepped back from the firing panel. Just 1 step, just enough to make it clear to himself in his own body what the situation was. The channel between the 2 ships stayed open for another 30 minutes. Voss and Jack talked through the preliminary framework. They talked about boundary markers. They talked about communication protocols. They talked about the process by which formal representatives would meet, and where and under what conditions. They talked like 2 people who had, through the particular logic of the situation they were in, arrived at the understanding that talking was what the situation called for. At the end of the 30 minutes, Jack said, "I will present a recommendation to the High Council." Voss nodded. "We'll wait for their response." A pause. "You'll continue to use the corridor in the meantime," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," she said. Another pause. "Of course," he said, and there was something in how he said it, not quite resignation, not quite acceptance, but some combination of the two mixed with something that might, in a different species, have been called respect, that Prith, watching from his console, found more interesting than almost anything else that had happened in the past 3 hours. The channel closed. The Vreth Armada held its position for another 2 hours, then in a sequence that began with the escort ships and ended with the endless Dominion, transitioned to faster than light and departed the corridor. The Iron Meridian stayed. Its running lights continued to blink. Amber, steady, slow, the same rhythm they had maintained since the beginning. It stayed in the corridor, and it waited, as it had been waiting all along, for whatever came next. 3 months after the endless Dominion departed the Hellion corridor, Fleet Admiral Jacket stood in the hall of the High Council and gave his report. The hall was the oldest room in the Vreth Dominion seat of government. It was built from stone quarried on the Dominion's home world, dark and dense, and slow to warm under artificial light. The ceiling was high and curved, and the sound in the room behaved the way it did. In places built for authority, voices carried clearly without echo, as if the room itself had been designed to make sure that everyone present heard everything being said and had no excuse not to. There were 9 High Counselors. They sat in a raised arc at the far end of the hall, and Jacket stood on the open floor below them, alone in the way that a commander stands when being formally debriefed. His hands were at his sides. His bearing was correct and military and showed nothing in particular. He had been in this room before. He had received commendations here. He had been given new commands and new territories and new authority here. He had stood on this floor and looked up at the counselors and felt each time the specific satisfaction of a man whose record speaks for itself. This was a different kind of standing. High Counselor Draft sat at the center of the arc. He was the oldest of the 9, with the deep, near-black coloring of advanced Vreth age and a face that had spent many decades learning to arrange itself into an expression that communicated displeasure without ever becoming clearly readable enough to call hostile. He was looking at Jacket with that expression now. "You are recommending," Drath said, his voice carrying across the stone floor, "without difficulty, that the Vreth Dominion enter a formal non-aggression agreement with a species that has been in space for 80 years. I am Jacketh said, with a species that violated our territorial boundary, with a species that disputes the validity of that boundary, which is a different thing." Drath looked at him for a moment, and, "You are recommending this," he said, "on the basis of a scan of a single ship, on the basis of what the scan revealed." Jacketh said, "Which is not the same thing." The counselor to Drath's left, a heavy-set man named Vorak, who ran the Dominion's military budget and had opinions about most things, leaned forward in his seat. "You had 7 ships," he said. "The human vessel was alone. You are telling this council that you could not resolve the situation from a position of complete numerical advantage. Jakoth looked at Vorak. I am telling this council, he said carefully, that numerical advantage is a calculation, and that when I did the calculation, the result was not what I expected. He paused. I would rather do calculation and act on the result than ignore the result because it is inconvenient. Vorak sat back. He did not look satisfied, but he did not press further, because Jakoth's record was a thing that existed and that everyone in the room knew, and arguing with a man who had never lost an engagement about his calculations was a specific kind of argument that required more certainty than Vorak had. Drath had read the scan report before this session. All 9 counselors had. Jakoth had submitted it in full without summary because he felt that a summary would reduce the data in a way that allowed a reader to stay comfortable with their existing assumptions, and he did not want the counselors to remain comfortable with their existing assumptions. He wanted them to sit with the numbers the way he had sat with them. He was not sure it had worked. Counselors, in his experience, were skilled at reading reports in ways that confirmed what they already believed. But he had tried. Let me ask you something directly. Drath said, were you afraid? The hall was very quiet. Jakob considered the question. He considered it seriously, which was the only way he knew how to consider things. I was appropriately cautious, he said. Drath made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. That is a very careful answer. The situation called for care, Jakob said. It called for action, said another counselor, younger, from the military oversight division, the kind of man who had never personally been in a position where the weapons on the other side were larger than the weapons on his side. You had overwhelming force, you had legal justification, you had a clear violation of Dominion territory, and you chose to negotiate. I chose not to die, Jakob said. The hall was quiet again. He had not planned to say it that baldly. He had planned a more layered answer, something about strategic assessment and long-term Dominion interests. But standing in this room, in front of 9 people who had not been there, who had not seen the numbers, who were looking at this through the lens of what they thought the Vreth Dominion was capable of rather than through the lens of what he had seen the humans be capable of, the layered answer felt dishonest. He had chosen not to die. That was accurate. You reviewed the intelligence file, he said, addressing the council as a whole, rather than any individual member. You read what we know about human history, 10,000 years of continuous internal conflict, a species that built weapons capable of ending their own civilization and did not use them on themselves, a species that redirected all of that energy and that capacity and that particular kind of inventiveness that only comes from 10,000 years of trying to survive each other, redirected all of it toward the stars. He paused. The Iron Meridian, he said, is hull number 412 in its class. There are 4 classifications above it. We don't know what those ships look like. We don't know their capabilities. What we do know is that the humans chose to show us the 412th ship in a class they consider mid-tier. They didn't send us their best. They sent us something they were comfortable letting us examine. Detail. He looked at Drath. That is a choice, he said. That is a Very specific, deliberate choice. And what that choice tells me is that whatever they did not show us, whatever is above the Vanguard class, whatever is sitting in their shipyards, whatever is at the upper levels of their military capability, they are not afraid to keep it hidden because they know that what they did show us is already enough. The room was quiet. He could feel the quality of that quiet. It was different from the quiet that came from disagreement or from discomfort. It was the quiet of people doing a calculation. He let them do it. The humans, he said, did not come to the corridor to fight us. They came to show us a thing, a specific, selected, calibrated thing, and then they waited for us to understand what we were seeing. He looked at the arc of counselors. They are patient. They have always been patient. A species does not survive 10,000 years of internal conflict without learning patience. They sat in that corridor for days alone, surrounded by 7 of our ships, and they were not frightened. And that not the weapons array, not the whole composite, not the 411 other ships of the same class. That is the thing that I came back from the Hellion corridor needing to tell you. Drath looked at him for a long time. They weren't frightened, he said. No, Jakoth said. And that is more significant to you than the technical data. The technical data is significant, Jakoth said, but the technical data tells me about their capacity. The behavior tells me about their nature. And their nature is this: they have been in danger in one form or another for 10,000 years. They have calibrated themselves to it. It is not that they are incapable of fear. I believe they are capable of it. It is that they have trained collectively and individually to function at full effectiveness in conditions that would degrade most other species, to remain calm and ready and clear-headed when everything around them is a threat. He thought about Commander Voss, reviewing maintenance reports while his armada sat outside her ship. They are not reckless, he said. They are not aggressive. They are not the kind of danger that attacks without reason, but they are prepared in a way that I have not encountered before for the possibility that they may need to fight. And they have made that preparation, the depth of it, the scale of it, visible to us on purpose. He looked at the counselors. The best weapon they have is not on any of their ships, he said. It is the knowledge of what they have not shown us, and they have given us that weapon intentionally because they know what it does when it lives in an enemy's mind. The vote on the treaty recommendation took place 4 days later after sessions of debate that Jasek was not present for. He had given his report and submitted his recommendation and then returned to his duties because the decision was the council's to make, and he had done what he could to inform it. The treaty recommendation passed. 7 votes to ratify, 2 abstentions. Draft had voted to ratify. Vorik had abstained. The younger counselor from military oversight had voted to ratify, which had surprised Jasek when he heard about it, though when he thought about it, it made a specific kind of sense. The man had never been in the position of having the weapons pointed at him. But he could read a scan report. He could do math. Sometimes math was enough. The formal treaty negotiations began 41 days after the council's vote. They took place on a neutral station in unclaimed space staffed by diplomats rather than military personnel, conducted over the course of 6 weeks. The Hellion corridor was designated as a shared transit zone with formal protocols for both Vreth and human vessels, no weapons testing within the corridor, no military buildups within a defined distance of its edges. Monitoring stations jointly operated at the corridor's entry and exit points. It was not a perfect agreement. It was the kind of agreement that emerged from two parties who were not entirely comfortable with each other but who had each decided that the alternative to negotiation was something neither of them could win cleanly. It had the texture of a document written by people who were being careful with each other. That was fine. That was in fact what an agreement between species who had not fought each other yet tended to look like if everyone involved was paying attention. On the day the treaty was signed, Prith was in his quarters aboard the Endless Dominion, which was on routine patrol in a different sector entirely. He had been on routine patrol since returning from the Hellion corridor, doing his job, running scans on things that were entirely ordinary and unremarkable, filing reports that nobody found alarming. He had kept a copy of the Iron Meridian scan results in his personal files. He was not sure why exactly, except that he found himself returning to them in the way you return to a thing that changed the way you think about other things as a reference point, as a before and after marker. He had read in the military communications that filtered through official channels that the treaty had been ratified. He had read the summary of the terms. He had sat with that information for a while before going back to his scan data. He looked at the hull composite results, at the weapons array numbers, at the performance estimates for the mass driver cannons, at the reactor data, at the sealed lower deck inventory, at the two words in the corner of the biological analysis section. Classification unknown. He had thought about those two words lot over the past 3 months. He had turned them over in quiet moments, in the hours between duty shifts, in the particular kind of thinking that happens when you are not actively working but your mind is still moving. He had thought about what it would take for a scanner system to encounter a biological reading it couldn't classify. The system had an enormous database. It had been calibrated on dozens of species, in every kind of situation, under every kind of stress. It had a category for fear, for aggression, for pain, for excitement, for calm. It had subcategories in gradations and edge cases. It had been designed to be thorough, and it had encountered 1,847 humans in a combat-ready ship, and it had found nothing in its library that fit. He had thought initially that this was a limitation of the scanner, that the human's biology was simply different enough from the species in the database that the system couldn't make the translation, that the markers were there but in a form the scanner didn't recognize. The more he thought about it, the less sure he was that this explained it. What if it wasn't a translation problem? What if the scanner had found the right data and simply had no category for it? Because no species it had ever encountered produced that specific combination of biological signals, that specific context. What if the humans weren't producing fear because they genuinely were not afraid, and the reason they weren't afraid was not that they didn't understand the danger, but that they had been in danger so many times, in so many forms for so long, that their relationship to it was fundamentally different from every other species. The Scanner had cataloged. What if you could spend so long in danger that it simply stopped triggering the same responses? Not because you became numb to it, but because you adapted to it at a biological level, the way you adapt to anything that is present long enough and consistently enough to become part of your normal operating conditions. He thought about that. He thought about a species that had lived inside the possibility of its own destruction for thousands of years, that had pointed weapons capable of ending civilization at its own cities, and had then decided at some point to step back from that edge and redirect, not because the weapons went away, not because the danger went away, but because they had chosen, collectively as a civilization, to take all of that capacity and all of that hard-learned understanding of what danger was and how to survive it, and to use it differently. He thought about Commander Voss and the way she had sounded on the communication channel, the way she had spoken his language, which she had learned in 8 months in the same even, unhurried voice she used for everything else, the way she had answered questions directly and without performance, way she had said a different kind of conversation without needing to elaborate because the elaboration was already present in the room. He thought about the maintenance reports. That detail had come to him from a crew member on the Endless Dominion who had a contact on another vessel that had picked it up from a communication that had filtered through unofficial channels, the way details always traveled through military networks, person to person, in the spaces between official reports. The human commander had been reviewing maintenance reports while the Armada sat outside her ship. He had found that detail more revealing than almost anything else. Not because it was brave, not because it was a show of strength, but because it was ordinary, because it said in the clearest possible way that the situation they were all treating as an emergency, as an event, as a thing that required total focus and elevate readiness, she was treating as a Tuesday. Not dismissively, not carelessly. She was at battle stations. Her crew was deployed and ready. She was absolutely paying attention. But she was also reviewing maintenance reports, because there was always maintenance to review, and because the job didn't stop, because someone was pointing weapons at you, and because the kind of person who could sit in a chair and do ordinary administrative work while an armada decided what to do about her ship was the kind of person who had a very stable relationship with the possibility of things going very wrong. The kind of person you got from 10,000 years of things going wrong and surviving them. Prith opened his personal log. He had started keeping it after returning from the Hellion corridor, which was something he had not done before in his career. He had not been the journaling type. He was a technician. He dealt in data, readings, in the concrete and measurable world of things the scanner could tell him. But the scanner had come up short in the Hellion corridor. It had given him a result it couldn't classify. And in the week since, he had found himself trying to work through what that meant in a way that required more than numbers, required words. He had written several entries about the scan, about the numbers, about the conversation between Jacketh and Commander Voss, about the treaty, about the things he had been thinking in the quiet hours. He wrote one more now. He wrote about what he had understood slowly over the past 3 months, that he had not understood on the day the scan completed. He wrote, we looked at them to find out how much they should fear us. That was what a scan was. That was what the Armada it. We arrived in force and we scanned their ship and we waited for the data to confirm what we already believed, that we were the more powerful party, that the advantage was ours, that the situation was straightforward. He wrote, we did not consider what it meant that they knew we would scan and decided to let it happen. He wrote, we did not consider what it meant that their crew was calm. He wrote, we did not consider what it meant that the commander was reviewing maintenance reports. He paused, he looked at the wall of his quarters for a moment, outside in the space that the endless dominion was moving through at low cruise speed. The stars held their positions in the dark, unchanged and indifferent, the same as they had always been. He wrote, the most dangerous thing I have encountered is not a weapon and not a fleet. It is a species that has survived everything it has ever done to itself and arrived in the galaxy still ready for more, and is somehow, despite all of that, or perhaps because of all of that, choosing to talk first. He wrote, they gave us a choice between understanding what we were looking at and acting accordingly, or not understanding it and finding out the hard way what the difference was. The Admiral understood, the Council eventually understood. He wrote, I keep thinking about the two words classification unknown. Scanner said it couldn't categorize what it was seeing in that crew, but I think it was seeing something real. I think it was seeing what a species looks like when it has been through enough that it no longer produces the standard signals for danger, not because it doesn't feel the danger, but because danger is where it has always lived, and you don't panic. In the place you have always lived, you just do your job. He wrote, I looked at them to measure how much they should be afraid of us. He wrote, I did not understand until much later that they had looked back at us and that what they had seen had not frightened them at all. He closed the log. He sat in his quarters for a while, longer in the quiet, with the hum of the ship around him and the stars outside. His porthole doing what they always did, holding still, holding their distances, watching everything and saying nothing. He thought they felt different than they used to. Not bigger, not smaller either exactly. Just different, the way a familiar room feels different after something changes in it that you can't quite name, the way a known quantity shifts when you understand it differently than you did before. He thought about the galaxy, about all the species in it and their various stages of development and expansion and conflict, about the young species that stumbled into space and spent their first decades trying to figure out how it worked, about the old species that had been around long enough to think they knew everything that mattered. He thought about humanity 80 years into the stars, with 10,000 years of war and survival behind them, and an unknown number of ship classes above Vanguard, and a commander who reviewed maintenance reports in the middle of a standoff. He thought we were not the most dangerous thing in the corridor. He thought we should have known that before we arrived. He thought we know it now. Outside his porthole, the stars were exactly where they had always been. Light from the nearest one took years to reach him, and by the time it arrived, the source had already moved on. Everything out there was older than it looked, everything was further than it seemed. He stayed at his porthole for a while, looking at the dark and the cold fire scattered across it. And he thought about a single ship with amber running, lights drifting patient and still in a corridor that did not belong to anyone, waiting for the universe to catch up with what it already knew. He thought it had been waiting a long time. He thought it was probably used to that by now.